is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want. You can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Quick content warning: the end of the world isn't exactly a cheerful subject. We'll be briefly reviewing some of the upsetting events in Japanese history that influenced apocalyptic literature there. In particular, World War II, including the Battle of Okinawa, and several natural disasters, including the triple disasters of March 2011. This episode will mention death and rape, both historical and fictional, although it won't go into any graphic detail. In Part 1, we took a look at the origins of apocalyptic and dystopian fiction, especially English language apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. If you haven't listened to Part 1 yet, I strongly encourage you to go back and start there. As a quick review, apocalyptic fiction evolved from tales of the end of the world in Western and Central Asia. Modern tales of the end of the world took off in 19th century Europe and accelerated after World War II. Apocalyptic stories overlap with dystopian stories about human societies gone wrong, and these stories are often warnings about the direction our society is headed. Apocalyptic fiction is an expression of some of our greatest fears: environmental collapse, nuclear war, science pushing beyond what should be its ethical limits. Increasingly, a society so fractured that it can't endure much longer. Today, in Part 2, we'll turn our attention to specifically Japanese apocalyptic fiction. Ted Goosen is a highly regarded translator of Japanese fiction. Most famously, he's translated some work of Haruki Murakami. He has also translated some of the most recent work by Hiromi Kawakami to appear in English, including The Third Love, which is due out later this year, 2024. I'm very excited about that one. Just 2 weeks after the March 11, 2011 triple disasters of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear reactor meltdown, Goosen published an article in which he broke modern Japanese apocalyptic literature into 3 eras, and guessed that the event would be the start of a 4th. These also have some overlap with the eras of sci-fi we covered in our episode on Japanese sci-fi. For our Patreon supporters, I'll be doing some connecting the dots between the story of Japanese sci-fi and the story of Japanese apocalyptic fiction. According to Goosen, the first wave of Japanese apocalyptic fiction was a response to the atomic bomb, fictional responses to a post-nuclear world. The second wave of apocalyptic literature is made up of works that, quote, portray the apocalypse as the violent cleansing of a corrupt and decultured world. The third wave began in 1995 with the Kobe earthquake and the Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attacks, and Goosen anticipated, correctly, that 311 would begin a 4th wave of apocalyptic stories. We covered these kinds of stories about a year ago in an episode called Fukushima Fiction. I think he makes some excellent points, so I'm going to use Goosen's subdivisions today. I'll go into a little bit of depth about what was going on in contemporary Japan to mark off 1945, the beginning of the 1970s, 1995, and 2011 as watershed moments in Japanese history. And then I'll take a look at a few sort of key works of Japanese apocalyptic literature available in English from each period. I'm also relying heavily on the work of Motoko Tanaka, a professor at Tamagawa University in Tokyo, especially his book Apocalypse in Contemporary Japanese Science Fiction. You can find a link to the PhD thesis on which the book was based on the episode page. It's available through the University of British Columbia's Open Library. By his own admission, Professor Tanaka's study tends toward books and media targeted toward men. We'll discuss. It was nevertheless invaluable. But first, I'm going to go back and look at pre-modern Japanese apocalyptic fiction. Native Japanese religions weren't nearly as focused on the end of the world as Abrahamic ones, especially Christianity. The Kojiki is the oldest collection of Japanese myths. It has a lot to say about how things began in Japan, but nothing to say about how things will end. Buddhism originated in India in the 500s BCE. It moved along the Silk Roads to China by the 200s and to Korea by the 300s. It was imported to Japan by the 500s during the Asakusa period, that's 538 to 710. And early Japanese Buddhism wasn't that concerned with the end times either. The story changed a bit after 1185. There was a brutal civil war in Japan called the Genpei War between 1180 and 1185. The end result was the fall of the Heian court, depicted in classical Japanese literature like Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji and Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book. That meant the end of the Heian period of Japanese history, 784 to 1185, and the beginning of a more or less continual civil war that lasted until Ieyasu Tokugawa became shogun in 1603. Under pretty apocalyptic-looking circumstances, some Buddhists and lay people turned to Buddhist teaching. We went into Kamakura Buddhism in greater depth in a Season 1 episode called Setsuwa and Medieval Japanese Buddhism, but I'll cover what's relevant here. As usual, I'm doing my very best to represent living religious traditions fairly. I'm happy to be corrected where I have failed, and happy to post corrections too. Buddhist teaching passes through 3 ages. Japanese Buddhists linked the 3 ages to specific moments in Japanese history. First comes the former day of the Dharma, or the age of the right Dharma. Dharma is a term for the teachings of Buddhism. During this age, the disciples of the historical Buddha, Gautama Buddha, are able to uphold his teachings. According to medieval Japanese Buddhists, the former day of the Dharma ended in 552, the year the Chronicles of Japan gives for the introduction of Buddhism into Japan from Korea. This is probably the wrong date, nevertheless. Next comes the middle day of the Dharma, or the age of the semblance of Dharma. During the middle day of the Dharma, contemporary Buddhism only looks like correct teaching, only resembles it. In other words, priests can mostly guess and teach and live by what Buddha intended. But it has been too long, the tradition is corrupted, people have been corrupted, and priests aren't getting it quite right. According to medieval Japanese Buddhists, the middle day of Dharma ended in 1052, exactly 500 years after Buddhism supposedly arrived in Japan. Finally comes the latter day of Dharma, or the degenerate age of Dharma, in Japanese, Mappo. Mappo is a 10,000-year age during which the Dharma gradually declines. It's a period of unrest, strife, famine, natural disaster. At the end of 10,000 years, the Buddhism of Gautama Buddha will lose all power of salvation, and a new Buddha will appear to save the people. Even though Mappo and a kind of end-of-the-world pessimism were more common in medieval Japan, there isn't a lot of what we'd call apocalyptic fiction, and there isn't a lot of what we'd call fiction in medieval Japan either. There are warrior epics like The Tale of the Heike, and there are poems and essays in a more apocalyptic vein. Motoko Tanaka describes Kamo no Chomei's essay The Hojoki as, quote, a representative medieval literary work with apocalyptic themes. Japan became a much more stable place after 1603. That's when Ieyasu Tokugawa became shogun of Japan. It's the first year of the Edo period, a period of relative peace that lasted all the way until 1868, as you might imagine, the apocalypse seemed a good bit less imminent when the countryside wasn't in a constant danger of civil war. There were still religious movements that used apocalyptic imagery to appeal to the have-nots of Edo Japan. That's a little outside of our scope today. But there still weren't a lot of apocalyptic stories, religious or fiction, on the minds of most Japanese people. The Edo period of Japanese history ended in 1867. That was 15 years after U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor and forced Japan to open itself to American trade. The Meiji period that began in 1868 brought with it huge cultural changes. We've discussed them at length in many episodes of this podcast. As you might expect, it also brought on new kinds of apocalyptic thinking. Not only did the arrival of American and European culture bring new kinds of storytelling, I imagine the circumstances of the culture's arrival might have seemed pretty apocalyptic. Add to that new scientific fears. For example, in late Edo and early Meiji Japan, comets and newly discovered planets added new fears of global destruction. Many cultures have looked to the sky for signs and portents of things to come. And that includes Anglo-American culture. But these comets and planets weren't just omens anymore. People were beginning to understand the danger of a celestial body colliding with the Earth. So what did the introduction of modern apocalyptic storytelling look like in Japan? To oversimplify, the Meiji government was all about civilization and enlightenment, bringing the country up to Western standards of education and scientific knowledge as quickly as possible. Science fiction held a natural appeal under the circumstances, so Anglo-American science fiction stories caught on pretty quickly in Japan. More than 30 titles by Jules Verne appeared in Japanese translation between 1878 and 1888, for example. Popular apocalyptic stories imported from abroad included 1903's The End of the World by American-Canadian astronomer Simon Newcomb. That one was translated and published in Japan in 1905. A scientist correctly predicts that a celestial object will crash into the sun, causing it to temporarily expand and kill all life on Earth. Japan was producing its own apocalyptic novels by the late 1800s. Kajo Nakagawa's 1898 The End of the World took up a real-life warning by an Austrian astronomer that a massive comet would crash into Earth in November 1899. That obviously didn't happen. Literary critic Yasuo Nagaya argues that these kinds of early stories tended to avoid an absolute end. In fact, when apocalyptic stories were translated, the translator often changed the ending to make the imagined disaster into the narrator's nightmare. As usual, Ryunosuke Akutagawa doesn't really fit into the narrative of 20th century Japanese literature, 20th century Japanese apocalyptic literature, even though he's one of Japan's most important modern writers. Most of his stories weren't explicitly apocalyptic. I suppose you could say he had a kind of apocalyptic imagination. His 1927 novel Kappa, one of his last works, is part dystopia, part satire on contemporary Japanese society. Scholar Susan Napier calls it Japan's first full-blown dystopian novel. In one of the novel's most striking and famous scenes, a father-to-be asks a fetus if he wishes to be born into this world. In a recent translation by Lisa Hoffman Kuroda and Allison Markin Powell, the almost-born Kappa responds, "I do not wish to be born. The hereditary mental illness of my father is bad enough, and besides, I believe that life as a Kappa is a poor existence." The mother then miscarries, and the unborn Kappa dies. World War II changed storytelling almost everywhere, really. No one knows how many people were killed in World War II, but it's likely 70 to 85 million people died. 3% of the total population of the world in 1940. The majority of the people who died were civilians. The Nazis in Germany killed more than 10 million civilians themselves, not only Jews, but also Polish, Roma, Sinti, and Slavic people, gay men, people with disabilities, religious minorities. The atomic bomb evaporated people off the streets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in seconds. In the past, an imaginary apocalypse could only be caused by an act of God, literal or metaphorical. Now human beings had the means to destroy themselves. But while it's true that World War II changed the apocalyptic imagination worldwide, it's perhaps especially true in Japan. Japan began the 1930s as an aggressor in much of East and Southeast Asia. It eventually suffered a massive defeat. Some of the most intense fighting and impressive destruction of World War II impacted Japan. The Great Tokyo Air Raid of March 9th and 10th, 1945, destroyed a third of central Tokyo. Between the incendiary bombs and the fires that resulted, more than 100,000 people died. We devoted an entire episode to Okinawan literature and covered the Battle of Okinawa at length. It took place between April 1st and June 23rd, 1945. The battle cost the lives of about 13,000 American troops and over 110,000 Japanese troops, including more than 30,000 Okinawan civilians who had been conscripted into the Japanese army just for the battle. Some of the civilians conscripted were school children. More than 100,000 Okinawan civilians also died. The Japanese government went out of its way to convince Okinawan civilians they would be raped and tortured if they were captured by the American military. Many Okinawans took their own lives to make sure that didn't happen, and the Japanese Imperial Army sometimes provided them with the means to do it. All told, the Battle of Okinawa left more than a quarter, maybe as much as half, of Okinawan residents dead. Japan's massive defeat came shortly after Japan became the first and only site of an attack by nuclear weapons. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki took place on August 6th and 9th, 1945, respectively. The blasts themselves killed between 130 and 230,000 people. Up to another 12,000 people died of burns and acute radiation syndrome in the month that followed. It's almost impossible to determine how many additional cases of cancer or other diseases the bombs caused. While fears that women who had been in Hiroshima or Nagasaki would bear children with birth defects turned out to be largely unfounded, those fears affected many women for the rest of their lives. The American bombings left scars on the people and landscape of Japan that still haven't fully healed. And they complicated Japan's war memory. Japan began the war as an aggressor, but ended as the victim of this truly awful attack. The massive defeat was also massively impactful on Japanese society and culture. It forced an emperor the government had promoted as divine to declare that he wasn't, in fact, a living god. It resulted in Japan's occupation by a foreign power for the first time ever. American occupation forces rewrote the Japanese constitution. Even though the new constitution was broadly supported by the Japanese, it fundamentally changed Japanese political life. Now, just to be clear, the events of World War II shaped the Japanese apocalyptic imagination, but the Japanese didn't use apocalyptic language to describe the events themselves. They didn't use apocalyptic rhetoric to describe the firebombing of Tokyo, and even Japanese historians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rarely use apocalyptic imagery. Nevertheless, Motoko Tanaka claims that the primary theme of apocalyptic literature between 1945 and 1970 is dealing with the aftermath of World War II in general and the use of nuclear weapons in particular. I suppose the same could be said of Japanese literature between 1945 and 1970 more broadly. There is an entire genre of Japanese atomic bomb literature. In Japanese, the term is genbaku bungaku. The term came into widespread use in the 1960s. The first work of what came to be known as genbaku bungaku is a short story by Yoko Ota called A Light as If from the Depths, and it was published in late August 1945, so less than a month after the atomic bomb attacks. But that was more or less the last work of atomic bomb literature published in Japan until after the end of the American occupation. Why? American occupation forces quietly, insidiously, censored an unlimited number of themes in Japanese literature and newspapers. The atomic bomb was most certainly one of them. We covered that kind of censorship of Japanese literature not only after but before World War II in a Season 1 episode, Japanese Literature in World War II. Check it out if you're interested in learning more. The American occupation ended in April 1952. I am most definitely going to do an entire episode about genbaku bungaku, but it also isn't quite the kind of speculative or pure fictional apocalyptic storytelling I'm trying to talk about today. I'm mentioning the genre because, one, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a kind of apocalypse in and of themselves, at least in the way American and European cultures think about apocalypse. And two, the literature that came out of the bombings influenced later, more purely fictional atomic literature. One of the more entirely fictional works of apocalyptic fiction dealing with the atomic bomb is Shigeru Kayama's 1955 Godzilla. Kayama was a prolific Japanese sci-fi writer. I'd be very tempted to do an entire episode on Kayama if more of his work were available in English. I'm pretty sure Godzilla is it, and it only arrived in English translation last year, translated by Jeffrey Angles. The film studio Toho asked him to write a scenario for a giant monster movie, and his scenario became the foundation for the 1954 film Godzilla. But the studio made some changes to his scenario along the way. That's very typical for the way a studio works. Around the time the second Godzilla film was released in theaters, Kayama published the novel Godzilla. It's a sort of adaptation of his original scenario, plus the movie, but showcasing more of Kayama's original vision for the way the Godzilla story was supposed to go. It is much more explicitly anti-nuclear than the films, and the films aren't all that subtle either. Remember that the first Godzilla film came out in 1954. The second film and both of Kayama's Godzilla novels, there's a sequel, came out in 1955. The U.S. occupation had only ended in 1952, and the occupation censored all but the most objective accounts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People weren't allowed to reflect on Hiroshima and Nagasaki within Japan. Actually, the American occupation didn't even allow the publication of photographs from either city until after 1950. Japanese people were only just beginning to talk publicly about their feelings regarding the bomb or their ongoing fears about radioactivity. In March of 1954, the ongoing situation with the existence of American nuclear activity had become a lot more concrete. A group of Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon No. 5 were accidentally caught 90 miles to the east of an underwater nuclear test off the Bikini Atoll. All 22 crew members suffered from severe radiation poisoning. One, 40-year-old Aikichi Kubuyama, died within a few months. Scientists also discovered some of the fish in Japan's markets had been irradiated. This was big news in Japan, and a big deal. People were understandably very upset. And so Kayama realized the proposed disaster movie was actually a chance to begin a kind of conversation about some of the issues for the first time since the end of the war. His original scenario for Godzilla was a much more explicit indictment of the US. He suggested that the film could open with shots like Lucky Dragon number 5 pulling into port, burned, the disposal of radioactive tuna, the unsettling faces of harmed fishermen. What makes Godzilla an apocalyptic story isn't just the monster's role as an allegory for the atomic bomb. And it isn't just Godzilla's deadly and destructive rampage through Tokyo. There's also a secondary conflict in the novel between scientists about what the role of science should be. For example, one scientist wants to preserve and research Godzilla, even though he's a deadly threat. I mean, props for compassion, none of this is Godzilla's fault. More importantly, the device that destroys Godzilla is potentially even more deadly than nuclear weapons. It's called an oxygen destroyer. I have to assume that sounds perhaps more threatening in Japanese, but it breaks apart oxygen atoms in liquid water, which is great because Godzilla keeps escaping to sea. The scientist who created it explains, "I am just a scientist who takes his work seriously. All I was doing was testing the limits of this power." But the scientist has come to understand the kind of threat that a device like the oxygen destroyer poses if it's weaponized, and he just doesn't trust human beings with that kind of power. Eventually, he gives in to the use of the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla. He makes one, and only one, fully operational oxygen destroyer device, and then burns all of his notes. He deploys it himself and then allows himself to die in the aftermath so that no one can use this kind of weaponized scientific device ever again. A peer comments that he wasn't able to trust people in our day and age, not even himself. Who could guarantee that the oxygen destroyer would never be used as a weapon of mass destruction, not even the man who invented it? This is perhaps one of the most hopeful visions of apocalypse that we're going to talk about today. Jun Bungaku, or high literature authors, started writing apocalyptic fiction in the 1950s and 1960s too. Usually on the same sorts of themes as less reputable works of fiction. I hope you can hear the air quotes here. Kobo Abe, for example, published Inter Ice Age 4 in 1959. Yukio Mishima published Beautiful Star in 1962. And Kinzaburo Oe published an as-yet untranslated apocalyptic novel. Scholar Susan Napier renders the title as The Floodwaters Invade My Soul in 1974. I do want to mention here two examples of works that fall a little bit outside of Tanaka's framework, and both are by a man named Sakyo Komatsu. Sakyo Komatsu was an Osakan science fiction writer born in 1931. Komatsu's novel Virus, The Day of Resurrection is a 1964 novel about a biological weapon developed from an alien organism. When released, it kills all but about 10,000 humans on Earth. Japan Sinks is perhaps even better known. It's Komatsu's 1972 novel about a series of geological events that caused Japan to disappear beneath the Pacific Ocean over the course of just a few years. Neither Virus nor Japan Sinks is a nuclear narrative. And Komatsu is also not a part of the wave of violent disillusionment we're going to talk about in just a minute. But his novels were hugely popular. Japan Sinks sold more than 4.5 million copies. Not only were they popular at the time, they've also had surprising staying power. Japan Sinks found new readers after the 1995 Kobo earthquake and the 3/11 triple disasters. We'll discuss both events. Virus saw its own resurrection in 2020 in the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak. to understand the turn in 1970s Japanese apocalyptic literature, Japanese literature in general, you really have to know more about 1960s counterculture in Japan, how truly disappointed some of Japan's young people were. We had an episode on this moment in Japanese fiction in season 1. I've recorded this story in more detail several times. It's gotten cut entirely. It's gotten moved to bonus content. It's gotten abbreviated. Honestly, this is part of my incentive for experimenting with multi-part episodes. Since I've broken this episode up into multiple parts, I think I can really dig into the lead up to the Summer of Rage, provide a little bit more detail about the Summer of Rage itself, and about the aftermath of the Summer of Rage, as well as the 1960s. You might find yourself understanding the lives of several of our authors a little bit better, especially Yukio Mishima, Kinzaburo Oe, Izumi Suzuki, and Haruki Murakami. You might know that the philosophical basis for the American occupation of Japan started out pretty idealistic and pretty liberal. As I've mentioned before, the Japanese constitution that Americans wrote for the Japanese remains one of the most progressive in the world. Even though Americans didn't give the Japanese much choice about adopting it, it was reasonably popular. But it also wasn't long before American occupation forces reversed course. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949. Mao Zedong declared China a communist people's republic in October of 1949. And pretty soon, the U.S. wasn't that interested in progressivism anymore. They wanted instead a bastion of conservative, pro-American capitalism in the East. Japan seemed perfect. Alongside these policy changes, the occupation depurged some of the right-wing figures that had been expelled from public life in 1945. Some of these figures even returned to power in the 1950s and 60s. So the reverse course was one disillusioning fact of life going into the 1960s. So was the ongoing working relationship between the U.S. and Japan. When the U.S. occupation ended, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty defined the U.S.-Japan relationship. Some conservatives were mad that the treaty left Japan in what seemed an awful lot like a subordinate position. And remember, the Constitution forbids Japan from having an offensive army. Many progressives and socialists were mad about the presence of American troops at all. At the end of the American occupation, there were still more than 80,000 American troops stationed in Japan. And this doesn't include troops in Okinawa. The prefecture had not yet returned to Japanese control. Local residents complained about noise, chronic traffic, crime, violence, rape. Besides, some liberals pointed out, aligning Japan with the U.S. in the Cold War surely violated the pacifistic spirit of Article 9 of the Constitution and probably made Japan into a target as well. Enough Japanese people were unhappy that the Japanese Prime Minister talked the American ambassador into renegotiating. The U.S. signed a revised treaty in January 1960. Now Japan just had to sign. No one in Japan liked the new treaty much better than they had liked the old one. Controversy over the new treaty is one of the most important contributing factors to 1960's Summer of Rage. Protests against the new treaty grew dramatically through the spring and summer of 1960, and these protests are now collectively known by the acronym ANPO, Anti-Security Treaty Protest. The night the treaty was finally ratified by the Diet, Japan's legislative body, the Speaker of the lower house had to be carried into the room like a human battering ram, and the vote only won because members of opposition parties were out of the room. Even after the vote passed, protests didn't stop. They swelled to include over 100,000 people, and they grew so violent that President Dwight Eisenhower had to cancel a planned visit to Japan. The treaty ultimately passed and was signed into law, but many Japanese people thought of this moment as a gross failure of the democracy they hoped had come to Japan. The other big event of the Summer of Rage was the Mitsui Corporation's Miike coal mine strike. To make a long story short, the Mitsui company eventually broke a strike of unionized coal workers. The early days of the post-war period were something of a shining moment for organized labor, so breaking the strike was quite a blow, and it was another disillusioning moment for progressives and progressive politics. The sort of last gasp for progressive politics in Japan were the student protests in 1967 and 1968. After the Summer of Rage, protests, and student protests in particular, had continued, but things were mostly quiet. A protest against the Prime Minister's visit to South Vietnam left a Kyoto University student dead in 1967, and this event reignited the student protest movement in a big way. In 1968, students at Nihon University erected barricades to protest financial misdealings at their institution. Barricades at the University of Tokyo soon followed. Later, students raided professors' offices and refused access to campus buildings. They even kidnapped certain professors and held them hostage. Protest continued even after some of the students' initial demands were met, and their demands grew. They went from demands that were transparently just to a somewhat more complicated situation. That October, nearly 20,000 students occupied Tokyo's important Shinjuku station. More than 1,000 police officers were injured in what's now called the Shinjuku riot. By January 1969, the government was fed up. It sent 8,000 armed riot police for an 11-hour siege to dislodge the students at Tokyo University. A month later, police broke down the barricades at Nihon University. And that was pretty much it. The student protest movement faded from view. Students went on to join the corporate grind. One professor who had been kidnapped later recalled one of his kidnappers asking for a letter of recommendation. I think these disillusioning events, the promise of a progressive future that broke down, the absolute failure of all attempts to do anything about it, are really important to Japanese apocalyptic literature in the 1970s and 1980s. Ted Goosen describes, quote, the second wave of apocalyptic narrative as work that, quote, portrays the apocalypse as the violent cleansing of a corrupt and decultured world. We'll look at a few stories that aren't necessarily violent, but corrupt and decultured are certainly key. Goosen continues, quote, this is the dark yet gleeful symbolic revenge, as it were, of Japanese youth during an era of smug material affluence, the bubble years, when the system their parents had built seemed unassailable. And Goosen means literally unassailable. Many of these authors were part of the movements that had tried to assail the system and failed. These writers were working through a period of economic success and technological innovation in Japan. They were nonetheless discontent with the costs of Japan's economic miracle. Things like environmental destruction, impossibly long working hours, gendered expectations of men and women, incredibly high standards for students. Writers often predict, sometimes pretty accurately, the inevitable consequences of the setup in the 1970s and 80s. Some of them are pretty prescient about the popping of the economic bubble and the lost decades. I'm going to list a few of my favorite examples of second-wave Japanese apocalyptic literature and describe how they correspond with Goosen's description of a, sometimes, violent cleansing of a corrupt and decultured world, and or how they are a dark yet gleeful symbolic revenge. And I'll list them in chronological order. Ryu Murakami, not to be confused with Haruki, to whom he is not related, published Coin Locker Babies in 1980. Coin Locker Babies is a long book about two boys found in storage lockers in Tokyo's subway stations, wreaking their revenge on a world whose mothers could abandon its children. In Coin Locker Babies, the city of Tokyo is already pretty dystopian before the boys arrive as teenagers. A large part of the central city is dubbed Toxitown and closed off because of chlorine contamination in the soil. As we discussed in our episode about Studio Ghibli, Hayao Miyazaki published the manga Nausicaa between 1982 and 1994. Yes, this is a manga and not a novel or a short story, but if you've only seen the film, you should know that the manga gets much darker. In the 30th century, a handful of scattered human civilizations attempt to survive on the edges of the environmental destruction left behind by the 7 Days of Fire 1,000 years before. There's a toxic jungle, or sea of corruption, depending on the translation, that's full of giant insects, especially the omu, and it constantly extends its borders. Nausicaa discovers that the omu and the sea of corruption are actually purifying the world so it's livable again. In the manga, she also discovers that human beings before the 7 Days of Fire bioengineered the sea of corruption, and the omu, and even Nausicaa and her contemporary humans, to live in the world they polluted until they can be resurrected. The plan is that Nausicaa and all humans like her will have to die so the pre-corruption humans can live again. A pretty grim apocalypse indeed. Akira is another apocalyptic manga, this time written by Katsuhiro Otomo. It was published between 1982 and 1990. This isn't a manga podcast. There are some excellent manga podcasts, notably Manga-splaining, which has devoted 6 episodes to Akira. But Akira is one of the most lasting and influential apocalyptic stories to ever come out of Japan. Akira is set in a post-apocalyptic Neo-Tokyo after World War III. The protagonist is a teenaged leader of a biker gang, and he's trying to save his psychic childhood friend from a Neo-Tokyo military leader. In the process, both of them get caught up in a multi-generational struggle against a mysterious and unstable psychic entity called Akira. Akira has the power to start another world war. So again, we've got youth in a violent struggle against what they fear is a corrupt system. This 1970s-ish to 1995 period is also the first time, at least in translation, that we get to see women's apocalyptic and dystopian visions coming out of Japan. It took women a long time to break into Japanese SF. If that's a story you're interested in, I encourage you, again, to check out our episode on Japanese sci-fi. That episode focused on the life and work of Izumi Suzuki. She was a remarkably prescient SF writer of the 1970s and early 1980s. Many of her stories are either apocalyptic or dystopian. Many are both. I'll mention Terminal Boredom, the title story of the first collection of her work published in English. In that story, old folks have so much energy and stamina they can go to work every day and somehow still find it in them to have love affairs. You'll see elderly people who fare better than young people come up again in the work of Yoko Tawada. Again, Suzuki is a very prescient author. She seems to have predicted Japan's demographic crisis when Japan's median age was still 32. Today, Japan's median age is 48. Young people in that Suzuki story don't even have enough energy to work. Some of them get so bored they forget to eat and lay down and starve to death. Not for lack of funds, but because they don't get up and put food in their own mouths. They don't want to have children. They want to simply, quote, slip quietly into oblivion all by themselves. Another dystopian vision by a Japanese woman is Mariko Ohara's Hybrid Child, published in 1990. Like many Japanese apocalyptic visions by women, it plays with gender and motherhood. It's about a male-coded robot that consumes the corpse of a young girl, then becomes a female-coded robot, survives several millennia, and then helps the remnants of humankind on one planet take on a planet-controlling maternal AI system that's gone haywire. The other notable early 90s women's dystopia is Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police. English readers might not realize the story's that old. It was translated into English by Stephen Snyder and published in 2019. It was a finalist for America's National Book Award and the International Booker Prize that year. The Memory Police is about an island where people forget about things like perfume, transit to other places, calendars. I'll wrap up this 1970s to 1995 era with a novel that might not strike you as particularly apocalyptic, A Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami. This one kept coming up in scholarly literature about apocalyptic fiction from Japan from this time period. I think it's because there are apocalyptic overtones, and it seems to sum up a certain Japanese attitude. It was published in Japan in 1982. The unnamed protagonist gets sent on a quest for an unusual-looking sheep with a star on its back. He eventually learns that the sheep has some sort of metaphysical tie to Japan's far-right movement. It can prey on human weakness, and if it finds another host, it's poised to change Japan forever in a sort of unstated but hinted nationalistic right-wing direction. By the end of the novel, the narrator finds out that everything important regarding the sheep and the search that he's carried out has already been done by someone else. The day has been saved, but the narrator has been more or less a spectator. Like many young people of Murakami's generation, it turns out the narrator is powerless, even in the face of a world-ending threat. We're caught up now with the story of Japanese apocalyptic fiction to about 1995. As you'll see in Part 3, 1995 was a pivotal turning point in Japanese history. So pivotal that it set off a new era of Japanese apocalyptic fiction. In Part 3, we'll turn to Gusen's last two waves of Japanese apocalyptic literature, 1995 to 2011, and 2011 through the present day. We'll also take a look at the life and work of Yoko Tawada, including her 2014 novel, The Emissary. We've covered a lot of texts today. You can find extensive lists on the episode page. The episode page has so much to offer, including a complete transcript, as well as external links to learn more and a complete bibliography of my sources. It also isn't too late to pick up a copy of our focus text for this episode, The Emissary by Yoko Tawada, also translated as The Last Children of Tokyo, translated by Margaret Mitsutani. North American listeners shouldn't forget to buy their copy through the episode page to support the podcast. You can also support the podcast by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice. The very best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Remember that Patreon supporters get early access and bonus content for every episode, as well as weekly updates on the podcast and new English language releases of Japanese literature. You can already get the full history of Japanese apocalyptic literature on our Patreon page in one big chunk, with more than 20 minutes of bonus content, both as an audio and with a PDF transcript. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. Through the website, Blue Sky at readjapaneselit.bsky.social, Instagram, also at Read Japanese Lit. We're on YouTube, / Read Japanese Literature. A big thank you to the Blue Sky community for helping me track down manga titles and manga translators. Even more of that in Part 3. Thank you to the Japanese literature groups on Goodreads and Facebook. and to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Twitter, with a special shout out to Forrest N. for early help brainstorming Japanese and apocalyptic stories to include. Thank you as always to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.